Thank you very much indeed for that kind welcome, and thank you for curtailing your bid for caffeine and coming back to the hall. I know that caffeine can be probably more attractive than listening to me, but it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you ever so much for the WPS Foundation for inviting me and for all of the supporting entities that have made this conference, this symposium possible. I do have to make two apologies at the beginning. Firstly, that I'm going to use the shorthand with your forgiveness and call a certain body of water the South China Sea. I was chatting to Bill Hayton, who you'll hear from later on this evening, if I let you go, that at least we're not talking about the North China Sea, which is sometimes called the Arctic Ocean. My second apology relates to the fact that as a geographer, I deal in pretty pictures and maps. So my apology is that I only have twice as many slides as Professor Silver. So my task is to look at particularly the regime of islands and also archipelagic states, archipelagic baselines, and archipelagic sea lanes, which of course we've already touched on in relation to the Philippines earlier on in the presentations. So under the regime of islands, I want to look at islands, and as Anna noted earlier in her presentation this afternoon, rocks, which are, I think of as a type of disadvantaged island. Rocks still have to fulfill the requirements of paragraph 1 of Article 121. And there'll be a little bit of history woven into how we look at the regime of islands before we deal with archipelagic baselines and so forth. So what types of insular features are we looking at under the regime of islands? Well, really fully entitled islands, that is islands that are not rocks, and that disadvantaged subcategory called the rock, which we'll look at in one moment. We'll look at low tide elevations and the definition of both low and high water lines to deal with that type of issue. And we'll look at artificial islands briefly before completely submerged features and moving on to archipelagic states. Next, please. Next. And next, please. So this is the so-called regime of islands. I think this rather over-dignifies things, calling this a regime. We're dealing with one article of the convention comprising 3 short paragraphs. Seems a bit much to call it a whole regime. It's a bit grand. Next, please. Paragraph 1 of Article 121 is the key one for defining what is an island or a rock. And there are 4 components, and they're relatively uncontroversial. The feature has to be naturally formed, so as we learned earlier from Professor Klein, artificial islands don't count in this category. Have to have a naturally formed feature, an area of land, and my legal friends, I'm a geographer by training, but with spending a lot of time with my legal friends, some of whom will dispute every single word. The word land may be fairly straightforward, but it is still capable of causing dispute, as we'll see. Surrounded by water. Well, we are dealing with islands, so that seems to make sense. And you have to have a feature that is above high tide. We talked a little bit this morning about baseline issues along the coast, where under the Law of the Sea Convention, your normal baseline is coincident with the low water line as marked on large-scale charts, Article 5 of the Convention. What we also need to know about is where the high water line level is in order to determine what constitutes land territory capable of appropriation. Next, please. Paragraph 2 of Article 121 essentially says that you treat islands just as you would any other part of your territory. So they generate the full suite of claims to maritime jurisdiction. But paragraph 3 is the awkward one. It defines where rocks which cannot sustain human habitation or an economic life of their own shall have no EEZ and no continental shelf. Now, every time you see an ambiguity or an uncertainty in the Law of the Sea Convention, you tend to know that there was a fight in the drafting of that provision. Here, essentially it's an even worse tale, because this text was actually produced in 1975 as the text for the basis of the negotiation. And we have ended up with the text for discussion as the final text, the final provision within the Law of the Sea Convention. Because despite myriad proposals and attempts, no one could come up with alternative language that could reach a consensus view. So we are left with some really quite ambiguous and uncertain terminology. What is cannot sustain human habitation? What is an economic life? And that's really at the heart of one strand of the ruling of the South China Sea Tribunal between the Philippines and China, which we'll get to in a moment. Next, please. It matters. It matters from the point of view of whether you have a fully entitled island versus a mere rock or a low tide elevation, in terms of the breadth of the maritime jurisdiction that it can generate. So if you have a fully entitled island isolated in the ocean with no neighbors within 400 nautical miles, then you can generate over 125,000 square nautical miles of territorial sea and EEZ. Whereas if you are a mere rock, you're restricted to 452 square nautical miles of exclusive economic zone. So an enormous distinction in terms of capacity to generate maritime entitlement, but with that comes implications for the delimitation of maritime boundaries. Because only a fully entitled island can be used as a base point for delimitation of an EEZ boundary. So that's where China, I think, missed an opportunity to challenge the jurisdiction of the tribunal in the South China Sea case by saying, well, maritime delimitation is not under the jurisdiction of the tribunal. If you decide what classification of feature we're looking at, that automatically has implications for maritime delimitation. But China wasn't party to the case, didn't turn up in The Hague, didn't make that argument. Next, please. Next slide. And next, and next. Two more tabs, please. So we have mainland territory. We have what we call mean sea level. Next, please. What we're looking for, or what our hydrographic friends are looking for to create a nautical chart, is to mark the low water line. That is part of what Anna determined to be that scientific stuff. And the terminology we need here is determining the vertical datum. That is deciding where the zero line is, the horizontal level below which you're measuring depths and above which you're measuring heights. And that's what chart makers do on their nautical charts automatically to show where the low water line is. We take advantage of that in a law of the sea context because chart makers tend to choose a very low vertical datum, a low zero line. Why? Because the purpose of the chart is safety of navigation. You want to show on the chart any potential hazard which will intersect the bottom of your ship. So you always tend to take a very low zero line. That's advantageous from a law of the sea and a coastal state perspective, because by taking a low zero line, you push the low water line further down the beach, further offshore. You advance the starting line from which you measure claims to maritime jurisdiction. Next, please. But you also need to know where the high tide line is, because you need to know what is territory. What's above high tide? The land dominates the sea. The maritime entitlements arise from your sovereignty over land territory. So you need to know both the location of the low water line and the high water line in order to determine, next please, what counts as an island and rock under Article 121, what counts as a low tide elevation under Article 13, that is covered at high tide, uncovered at low tide, or what simply counts as a feature of whatever zone it's in, of the seafloor of whatever zone it happens to be in, territorial sea or continental shelf. Next, please. And next, and next. Of course, the area of your island will entirely be dependent on which zero line you're looking at. At low tide, your feature, your land territory, appears much, much larger than it will do at high tide. That's a fairly obvious statement. But it can be, where you have a high tidal range, you can have an enormous difference between low and high tide. Next, please. Low tide elevations, very similar language to Article 121 in Article 13. Again, it's a naturally formed feature, so you don't build your own. An area of land, but surrounded and above water at low tide, submerged at high tide. These have been known as so-called parasitic base points. If they are wholly or partially within your 12-mile limit from an above high tide piece of territory, then you can use a low tide elevation as a base point. Next, please. And next, please. So we have a bit of continental territory. We have a 12-mile territorial sea limit. We have 4 low tide elevations offshore. Because low tide elevation is fully within the territorial sea from an above high tide feature. Number 2 is partially within. They can both be used as base points for generating additional areas of territorial sea. Next, please. But you can't keep leapfrogging, as it were, from low tide elevation to low tide elevation. So to demonstrate that, next, please. And next. This is part of a chart, Australian chart of the Great Barrier Reef. And say we had a storm out in the Great Barrier Reef. Next, please. And that storm rolled a large boulder up on top of that reef platform. On most nautical charts, everywhere green is an area that is covered at high tide and uncovered at low tide. So that rock is above high tide. As a consequence, its low water line is all the way around that reef platform. And therefore, if you generate 12 nautical miles, all of the low tide elevations that are wholly or partially within the 12-mile limit themselves can be used as base points. So you can see how low tide elevations can be quite powerful in generating additional areas of territorial sea. Next, please. Given the ambiguities inherent in Article 121, you would wish to analyze it and look at the drafting history. The drafting history doesn't help because as I indicated, we've ended up with the text for negotiation as the final output, the final provision. And the reason for that is you did have a fight. You had multiple states that possessed islands that wanted to maximize claims to maritime jurisdiction. You think of Greece in the Aegean, profusion of islands wanting to generate full suite of maritime claims, and those states that were disadvantaged by that and worried by that. So Romania was a key state in this, with an island called Serpent's Island in the Black Sea, just off the terminus of the land boundary between Romania and Ukraine. So the potential impact of that one small feature on Romania's maritime claims led it to try and propose all sorts of provisions, creating a new category of feature called an islet, unsuccessfully. So what we can do instead is start looking at some of the state practice. We'll look at Rockall, look at Akinotori Shima, and some of the case law. Next, please. So Rockall, and I think here the clue is in the name, is a feature that's about 160 odd nautical miles to the northwest of the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. Next, please. This is what it looks like. I'm giving a sort of travel agent's tour, but not a very effective one, I suspect. Now, the legal question for you is this a fully entitled island capable of generating 200 nautical mile EEZ and continental shelf rights, or is it a rock? Next, please. So is it, well, firstly in history, it wasn't very impressive. The first person known to have landed on it indicated the smallest point on a pencil could scarcely give it a place on any map that would not exaggerate its proportions. He was actually being quite kind compared to Lord Kennet. Next. This is in the debate in the House of Lords in the UK about annexing Rockall. There can be no place more desolate, despairing, and awful. I have one law professor colleague who's proposed method to determine human habitation is to take his law of the sea class, put them on the feature, come back in 3 months, see how many are left. Next, please. So, Rockall, do you consider it to be capable of human habitation, or does it have an economic life of its own? No, I don't see any hands going up. Well, you could be surprised. Next, please. Next slide. There you go. Now, the words that should be coming into your mind, or minds, there's probably different programs now, but photo and shop probably comes to my mind here. However, the UK annexed Rockall in 1975. In 1985, a former Royal Marine landed on Rockall, broke his ankle coming down from the helicopter, and stayed 40 days on Rockall to illustrate. He was mainly concerned about showing British sovereignty over the feature. Is that human habitation? I'm not sure. Next, please. It's not the only time Rockall has been occupied. Greenpeace occupied Rockall in the late 1990s, 1997. They helicoptered a pod on top, and they declared the independent Republic of Waveland. Next, please. And you see the flag of Waveland and the first 3 citizens. And to this day, I regret the fact that I didn't send off £5 to Greenpeace, and they would send you back your passport to Waveland in return. And I regret not doing that. The irony here, this guy is a chartered surveyor from Edinburgh, who is now the Guinness Book of Records holder for having spent 42 days on top of Rockall in his rock pod. Looks very scientific, doesn't it? It's a water tank painted yellow. The irony is that at the time Greenpeace were occupying Rockall and arguably proving human habitation, the UK was acceding to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It had been claiming a 200 nautical mile fisheries limit from Rockall, and it rolled back its claim, redetermined that Rockall was indeed a mere rock, not a fully entitled island, and pulled back its maritime claim. Next, please. That's the only example that I'm aware of a state having claimed 200 nautical miles, actually rolling it back. Akina Torishima is probably my favorite example of the extremity that states go to. You can't see it because it's the middle of that 200-mile limit for exclusive economic zone. It's the southernmost territory of Japan. Next, please. It also is critical to Japan's submission for extended continental shelf rights southward down the Kyushu-Palau Ridge system. Next, please. And there it is. There are 2 features. One is 6 and one is 16 centimeters above high tide. I think this photo is particularly good because it shows that while 4 people can stand on it, the 5th can't. Now, if you're the Japanese government, what do? This is your land territory above high tide. Well, you better protect it. Next, please. Because you're generating a 200 nautical mile EEZ claim from it. And there were 6 features, but they're gradually being undercut. Coral columns being undercut by wave action. Next, please. So you'd better protect it and spend $250 million. This is in 1988, where $250 million was worth something, in order to create sea defenses that are 360 degrees and physically higher than the naturally formed feature itself. Next, please. So here we have the feature. I don't think it's getting away. And the Japanese took a very literal interpretation of Article 121. The article says, surrounded by water. So there are channels through the sea defenses so the water can lap the naturally formed feature. Next, please. In terms of cases, they are few and far between which have actually addressed this issue of Article 121, I think intentionally. There have been many cases involving islands in maritime delimitation, but not concerned with the actual classification of features. In this case, between Nicaragua and Colombia, a key feature was Quitasueño, and apologies to anyone Spanish in terms of pronunciation. It's a broad coral platform with lots of little coral heads that may or may not be above high tide. The two states concerned, Nicaragua and Colombia, proposed different tidal levels for normal baselines. So Nicaragua was arguing, well, no, it's not really above water, so it's not territory. Secondly, it's only coral debris, so it's not real land. See, you can dispute any word. And anyway, it's really small. Ignore it. Next, please. The Colombians went out and surveyed it, broad coral bank. There is one feature that under the two tidal levels proposed by the parties is above high tide, QS 32. And the clue there is that the feature is white on top. Why? It's amazing how much seagull dung is important to the law of the sea and territorial sovereignty. Next, please. The International Court of Justice determined that, okay, it's above high tide. That one feature, one head of coral is above high tide, whichever of the two options for tidal level apply. Therefore, it's land. Therefore, the low water line is all the way around the coral platform. It doesn't matter that it's made of coral, so long as it's naturally formed. The fact that it's small is irrelevant. It doesn't make any difference. So we have some degree of clarity here. Next, please. Then we come to the South China Sea case. I've often wondered with these classic pictures quite what you have to say to your commanding officer to get posted here. But I'm in a polite company, I probably can't tell you. Next, please. Back one, please. And this is the largest island in the Spratly Island group, Ituaba, Taiping Island. In their naturally formed condition, the largest 12 features in the Spratly Island group amount to less than 2 square kilometers of territory. That's the kind of areas that we're dealing with. Next, please. So we have 4 sovereignty disputes. The Philippines team did an amazing job of framing its statement of claim in the South China Sea case so as not to touch on issues of sovereignty and not to touch on issues of maritime delimitation, because that was beyond the jurisdiction of the tribunal, and it's a case under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. So it cannot deal with the root cause of the South China Sea disputes, which is sovereignty over territory, over islands. Instead, it can deal with the classification of islands under Article 121, regardless of who owns them, who has sovereignty, and look at the issue of China's historical claims to historic rights in this body of water. Next, please. So there you see the tribunal. It was held under the Law of the Sea Convention. The proceedings were held in the Hague, in the Peace Palace, in the Great Hall of the Peace Palace. I was lucky enough to be independent expert witness appointed by the Philippines, so I gained an appreciation of the case from the inside. Next, please. Not dealing with sovereignty at all. The final outcome, I think you all know. The decision of the tribunal was that none of the features it was looking at, none of the above high tide features, are legally islands, fully entitled islands. They are legally rocks. Next, please. That decision of the tribunal is the first detailed judicial interpretation of Article 121. So in a sense, you can take that as an indication of an authoritative view or interpretation of Article 121 until such time, it's only one view, we may yet have future cases that take a different perspective or a different view on details of interpretation. First important one was that the tribunal indicated that the word rock doesn't mean rock, necessarily. And the tribunal, I'm sympathetic to the tribunal's reasoning here because the view was that it would make no sense if a feature made of a rocky substance was denied EEZ and continental shelf rights, but one made of a soft, sandy, silty, muddy substance could generate an EEZ or continental shelf. So it would defeat the restrictive intent of the provision. The view of the tribunal is that you need to analyze features based on their natural capacity, that is, without external additions or modifications. And the drive behind that, of course, is that this was taking place at the same time that China was undertaking large-scale island building activity and essentially covering features with millions of tons of sand. Next, please. This is a controversial decision, but it's an interpretation, and it's an interpretation without objective, bright-line rules. Okay, in terms of capacity for human habitation, in the natural condition, an island should be able to support a stable community of people without giving a number. Intentionally, I think, because the view of the tribunal was not solely on the South China Sea, it was to create a rule that potentially is applicable elsewhere on the planet. And a stable community of people in the Arctic is not going to be same size as a stable community of people in the tropics. There's a degree of flexibility built in, so the idea that a group of people could nomadically move among multiple islands, and those islands could, as a whole, be counted as fully entitled. Next, please. The other issue there is that not only do you need a stable community of people, but you need to maintain that community at a quote-unquote proper standard, which seems wide open to interpretation. Next, please. If instead of talking about human habitation, you're talking about economic life, then that economic activity has to be oriented around the population of the island, rather than going to send a fishing vessel out to an isolated feature and bringing the catch back. The overall logic of the tribunal was that the whole idea behind the exclusive economic zone was to give economic benefit to the coastal population. You gain the exclusive economic zone in order to provide for the coastal population. If you can't support human habitation and you're not providing economic life for the coastal population, then you don't necessarily need the exclusive economic zone, goes the logic. Now, you can argue with that logic, of course. It's open to interpretation. But this is the interpretation of the tribunal. Next, please. I mentioned large-scale island building, the wonderfully appropriately named Mischief Reef from 2012 to 2015. Next, please. We saw very large-scale island building activity. One of the other experts in the case, appointed by the tribunal, John McManus, fisheries biologist, he told a story that when he dived out at Mischief Reef, and he'd gone down scuba diving, and his dive buddy had gone back up with a problem, and when he was underwater, it went dark, and he thought, okay, thunderstorm. When he got to the surface, his dive buddy said, John, did you see the school of hammerhead sharks that went over your head? It's that sort of marine environment now completely destroyed as a consequence of large-scale island building. So the tribunal found that China had caused severe harm to the coral reef environment and violated its obligation to protect and preserve fragile ecosystems through large-scale land reclamation and construction of artificial islands. Next, please. So now, of course, we know that China did not participate in the case, regards the award of the tribunal as null and void and not binding on China. If we retain China's view either as the 9-dash line or indeed the 4 shahs, you get roughly the same result, about 80% of the South China Sea subject to competing claims to maritime jurisdiction. Should the tribunal's award be implemented, and I think this is why a fairly activist bench was intending to assist the South China Sea states in resolving their disputes, next please, you would end up instead with, next please, the areas of overlap restricted simply to the territorial seas around all the above high tide features, whoever owns them. And that would dramatically shrink the area of overlapping maritime claims. Next, please. Professor Klein mentioned artificial islands in her presentation. They're dealt with under paragraph 8 of Article 60 of the Convention. Explicitly, artificial islands do not possess the same status as islands, do not affect the delimitation of maritime boundaries, only generate a 500-meter breadth safety zone. Next, please. You can create your own artificial island. Usually you do so in your own maritime zone. Next, please. So here we're in the Maldives, and you can create an island out of garbage. This is an artificial island entirely composed of rubbish. Next, please. And it's been created in order to put high-value, important, but dirty installations like the oil depot on top of it. Next, please. But also for the Maldives, what they've done is, Male is one of the most densely urbanized, highly urbanized atolls on the planet. You've got about 2.2 square miles of territory and 210,000 people living on it. But they have built the international airport on an artificial island and built the Hula Humale, which is an artist's impression down there, but these pictures are from when I was on Hula Humale in January. You now have over 90,000 people living on that entirely artificial island, fairly high-rise, wide boulevards with trees, with parkland. It's really quite impressive. Essentially, when we're talking about sea level rise, Maldives will not be going under. Hula Humale is 3 meters plus above high tide. You can think of it as a very large, immobile lifeboat for the Maldives. So you would think, in one way, small island developing states are existentially threatened by sea level rise. Well, not necessarily. It's a different question about how you afford to do this, and that is the China-Maldives Friendship Bridge, which was agreed, and the loans associated with that to Chinese banks were agreed by a previous Maldives national administration. There are costs involved, but that's a different argument and issue around the consequences of this action. But Maldives has made very impressive moves to overcome the sense of threat to their national survival. Next, please. Through artificial island building. Back to the South China Sea Tribunal, the view of that tribunal, and I think it's a valid one, you can't turn a low tide elevation into an island. You can't turn it into a rock. You can't upgrade a rock into an island. In its natural condition, that is the point at which you analyze the feature, and what is a low tide elevation remains a low tide elevation. What is a rock remains a rock. You cannot upgrade the feature. Here there is, I think, scope for some debate. Reclaiming land from the sea, as you've seen in Manila Bay, is happening all the time. It's perfectly legal for a coastal state to do that. And potentially you could take a small feature and make it substantially bigger as a consequence of land reclamation. At what point does it gain the character of an island? Well, according to the South China Sea Tribunal, it will never be able to be upgraded, as it were, legally. Next, please. Now, I have a little time left to deal with archipelagic states, and only about another 80 slides. So next, please. As we've heard earlier this morning, archipelagic states are states composed of islands or parts of islands in the definition, Article 46. The reason for the odd terminology is, of course, Indonesia, which has sovereignty over part of the island of Borneo, but not the whole of it, part of the island of New Guinea, but not the whole of it. So this is based on Indonesia as one of the key archipelagic states, along with the Philippines and along with Fiji, who were championing the idea of the international community accepting archipelagic status, special conditions for archipelagic states. Next, please. Indonesia is the first adopter from 1957 and then articulated into law in 1960. The Philippines was right behind, 1961. There were some quirks about the Philippines legislation at the time, but we'll come back to that. And I count 23 archipelagic states, but I'm cheating slightly. Because Palau, even though Palau mentions archipelagic baselines in its constitution, hasn't actually produced legislation and declared where the archipelagic baselines are. So I'd count 22, and really I'd say 21, because the Dominican Republic is only an archipelagic state by including a low tide elevation which is on the wrong side of an international maritime boundary that it's agreed. And I find that a bit difficult to accept as a set of archipelagic baselines. Next, please. So, how do you define archipelagic baselines? Well, we have a state composed of islands or parts of islands. Go. Next one, please. You have 5 conditions. Keep going through 4 more taps. You need to include your main islands, and but the advantage is you can use your outermost islands and drying reefs. There's a test, a ratio test of water to land of between 1:1 and 9:1. Next, please. There's a length limitation of 125 nautical miles. There's also a requirement that less than 3% of your segments are over 100 nautical miles. And you've got to have a set of archipelagic baselines that fit the overall general configuration of your archipelago, which sounds more like art than science to me. Next, please. So let's look at those in detail. This is uncontroversial. There's no definition of what your main islands are, but no archipelagic state has ever faced a problem in terms of another state saying, aha, you haven't included your most culturally significant, or your biggest, or your highest population, or where your capital is. Every archipelagic state will choose what its main islands will be. Next, please. And then you define your archipelagic baselines. Within your archipelagic baselines, you may define other types of baseline, as not just normal baselines, but you might, next please, you might want to close a bay with a closing line, for example. You might want to close a river mouth within your archipelagic system. Next, please. Ratio. You need to enclose as much water as you have land territory. So that excludes states that are composed of 1 or 2 main islands, like the United Kingdom. Cannot enclose enough water to meet the 1:1 ratio. New Zealand would be in the same boat, so is Japan. The 9:1 ratio, why 9? I have no idea. It's a negotiated number from the drafters of the convention. The maritime powers were concerned that small island states composed of tiny features, widely dispersed, would end up claiming huge areas of the ocean and placing them under archipelagic waters, under the sovereignty of the coastal state. So their concern was met by putting a limit of 9 times as much water as you have land. Quite how they came up with 9, I am unclear. Next, please. You've got to look at the length of each of your segments. Next, please. Break them up, measure them, and make sure none are over 125 nautical miles long. Next, please. Next, please. You might want to close this area that's 130 nautical miles, so you have to break that segment into smaller segments. This is an issue that the Philippines has had to address from 1961 to 2009. Next, please. I think this 3% rule is an illusion because of course, it's the archipelagic state that's drawing the segments. So you can always break your archipelagic baseline segments into smaller and smaller segments and change the numbers if you need another segment that's over 100 nautical miles long. Next, please. Next, please. And in terms of the overall shape of the archipelago, or the configuration, well, I think that's, next please. If you had an outlying feature, if we ignore the length limitations, is that truly the configuration of the archipelago? You do get states that fulfill the ratio test, which you don't immediately think of as an archipelagic state. Jamaica is an example. I think of Jamaica as one large island, but actually they've got several Ks to the south, so they can enclose just enough, twice as much water as they have land. And they qualify with the land-water ratio. Whether the configuration is an issue, no one's challenged it so far. Next, please. And next. And next. From your archipelagic baselines, you generate all of your claims to maritime jurisdiction. Next, and next, and next, and next, and one more. There we go. So, territorial sea, contiguous zone, EEZ, and even outer continental shelf. The 1961 baselines, which Jay touched on first thing this morning, were described as straight baselines rather than archipelagic, and they did include one, I think it was 139 nautical mile long segment. That has all been fixed in the 2009 legislation. Next, please. So, archipelagic waters are under the sovereignty of the coastal state, of the archipelagic state. And that sovereignty extends to the airspace over the archipelagic waters. You generate your maritime claims from the seaward side of your archipelagic baselines. There's a provision requiring you to respect existing cables and pipelines. There's a provision also related to traditional fishing and navigation. And that was a concern raised by Malaysia in relation to Indonesia's archipelagic baselines. The Natuna Islands protruding between Peninsular Malaysia on one hand and Sarawak and Sabah on Borneo. So there is a treaty that allow between Indonesia and Malaysia, allowing for navigation by Malaysia between those two parts of Malaysia, and also for traditional fishing rights too. Next, please. In terms of sea lanes passage, which is the current topical issue here in the Philippines, next please. If you don't have any archipelagic sea lanes, then innocent passage applies within archipelagic waters. But if an archipelagic sea lane does exist, ships need to navigate through the ASL. Because it's innocent passage being applied within archipelagic waters in the absence of ASLs, archipelagic sea lanes, then just like in the territorial sea, innocent passage can be suspended in specific areas and temporarily. And that ban, that closure, is to be applied without discrimination. Next, please. In the back of our minds, we're beginning to think about Straits Passage and the Strait of Hormuz. Archipelagic sea lanes, very similar rules to transit passage for straits used for international navigation. If you have designated an ASL, as I believe you're about to do, then for foreign shipping must undertake passage in a lane, but in the absence of a designated lane can use routes used for normal navigation. And there's interpretation there if the Philippines doesn't designate as many lanes as the international community would desire. We have one archipelagic state of the 20-odd that we looked at who's actually designated archipelagic sea lanes, and that's Indonesia. We'll look at that in a moment. There is an obligation on the archipelagic state to give due publicity to where those lanes are and potentially provide for updated charting of those ASLs, undertaking hydrographic surveys. And we'll see why in a moment. And you may need to upgrade navigation aids too. Next, please. So, for archipelagic sea lanes, that applies to both sea and air. It applies to all ships and aircraft, including military. That transit has to be continuous, expeditious, and unobstructed by the archipelagic state. And it can happen in normal mode. What's the normal mode for a submarine? Which implies that the archipelagic state has to declare archipelagic sea lanes where they have undertaken the hydrographic survey so a submarine can safely navigate through the strait, submerged. There shall be no suspension of archipelagic sea lanes passage, unlike innocent passage through the archipelagic waters if there's no ASL. Next, please. That ASL sea lanes passage shall be within 25 nautical miles of the axis line defined by the archipelagic state for the ASL. You could read that. It's easier to look at a diagram. Next, please. This is the idea. You've got to provide a bit of a buffer for flanking islands. So if you can't manage a 50 nautical mile wide ASL, so it's only 22 nautical miles wide, then you've defined the axis line and you give a 10% buffer to the flanking island where you don't have passage through that right next to the island. Next, please. And that can be variable depending on where the islands are relative to the strait, depending where the archipelagic state defines the axis of the ASL. So it can be a different breadth on either side of the axis line. So it's up to the archipelagic state to define the ASLs and therefore the buffering on either side of the ASLs for the flanking islands. Next, please. Next one. Thank you. Now, Articles 39, 40, 42, and 44 also apply. Those are articles that relate to transit passage. And they apply mutatis mutandis, meaning with appropriate amendments to apply to archipelagic sea lanes passage. What it actually means is you substitute the words straits used for international navigation for archipelagic sea lanes. For ships and aircraft, you have to proceed without delay, without the threat of use of force. You have to be continuous. You can't pause in the ASL, and an expeditious passage. And you have to comply with international regulations. There's a prohibition on marine scientific research whilst undertaking ASL passage. You have to comply with coastal state laws, which we'll look at in the next slide. And you have an obligation not to interrupt your passage. For the coastal state, yes, you can apply some laws to ASLs, and you can regulate in relation to safety of navigation, to prevention of pollution, in relation to fishing vessels. For example, a regulation that fishing vessels must stow their gear, and you also can legislate to prevent the loading or unloading of any commodity or crimes in relation to what is known as fisc. And I'm not saying fish in a funny way. I'm talking about fiscal, immigration, customs, and sanitary laws, which are laws which are articulated in relation to the contiguous zone, so out to 24 nautical miles. Similarly, you can regulate in relation to fiscal, customs, immigration, sanitary, fisc. Next, please. The limitations on the archipelagic state for the Philippines to think about. You can't discriminate in relation to allowing passage through ASLs, and you can't do things which, in effect, the practical effect of denying, hampering, or impairing the right of passage. You need to give due publicity, and you would do that through the IMO, but also through the UN Division of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea. But the counterpoint is that foreign vessels need to comply with your regulations in relation to ASL for those specific issues that I mentioned. Where you have a foreign warship undertaking ASL passage and it breaches your regulations, it's subject to sovereign immunity, like Professor Klein mentioned, and ships on government service. Similarly, I won't go into the issue of whether a glider is a vessel or not, but it may be, at the very least, be government property. Therefore, you can't stop a foreign warship undertaking ASL passage, even if it's breaching your laws. But there may be an opportunity to take a case, for example, to ITLOS, in relation to international responsibility for any damage. Next, please. So here are Indonesia's ASLs from the late 90s, 1998. And Indonesia, as Professor Klein mentioned, probably went to the IMO thinking, this is it. This is a complete set of archipelagic sea lanes. Except Indonesia only provides for archipelagic sea lanes that are north-south, not east-west. And I think there was hesitation about that. There was an incident where a US carrier battle group went through the Java Sea between Java and Kalimantan with full combat air patrol going on and completely disrupted civilian air traffic. And when the Indonesian fighters went up and challenged the American ones, the response was, we're in international waters. International waters is a phrase you won't find in the Law of the Sea Convention. It's US parlance for freedoms of navigation all the way through the high seas and through the exclusive economic zone to the limit of the territorial sea of the coastal state. That's what the Americans mean through international waters. It's referring to those freedoms of navigation that exist both in the high seas and throughout the exclusive economic zone. Next, please. So, that, I think, are the proposed archipelagic sea lanes for the Philippines. Indonesia's experience is that the IMO has designated the 3 lanes it defined as a partial designation of ASLs. Personally, I don't necessarily see the merit of Indonesia not providing for an east-west lane, because in the absence of an ASL, then foreign shipping can go wherever it likes through innocent passage, and that will apply. So where is the advantage? Because in a sense, if you're declaring an ASL, foreign vessels need to use the ASL. So you're channeling where foreign vessels navigate. And that potentially is an advantage to the archipelagic state. I would suspect that when the Philippines goes to the International Maritime Organization for approval of its ASLs, and if these were the 3 ASLs, the international community, you're going to find maritime states saying, hang on a minute, we have a huge amount of shipping going down here and through here. And you will, I fear, face some pushback. Now the question is, are you happy with doing a partial designation of ASLs like this? And that's what the IMO will likely say, this is a partial designation, or do you want to amend and try and fulfill or assuage the concerns of some of the international community? But that could be an almost endless task, and every passage through the Philippine archipelago could be used. But in the absence of an ASL, it means foreign vessels can simply take those routes anyway and undertake innocent passage. Next, please. And that concludes my presentation. I admit that I like using cartoons in my presentations. The walrus is not that well known in these waters, I admit. But I do like the fact that he's got a sovereignty claim to a island, rock. We don't know whether this is low tide or high. It could be a low tide elevation. All right, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Professor Schofield. We now open the floor for the Q&A.
I could throw a microphone at you, but
It's
I'm not sure.
Professor, thank you so much. Not that I am interested in knowing what happened to the 42-day guy, okay? But since on the question of shifting maritime limits, okay, so because of sea level rise, for archipelagic states like the Philippines, our baselines maybe like 10 years ago may not be the same baselines that we have right now. Do you have any recommendations policy-wise as to shifting maritime limits? Thank you.
That's a really good question, because whilst the greatest threat of sea level rise relates to normal baselines, and really the threat is not necessarily around the level of the ocean. It's the fact that we're also dealing with increased frequency and intensity of extreme weather events on a higher basement of sea level. So it's not the sea level rise necessarily causing the impacts on your coast, it's the storms that produce enormous change in a very short period of time. Inundation, erosion, retreat of the location of the normal baseline. Pretty much, I would say, pretty much every coastal state could improve their baselines model. Many of, there's no one here from Vietnam, so I can use that as an example, but Vietnam declared its strait baselines in the 1982 and 1992 legislation. If you look at the satellite imagery of the Vietnamese islands that the strait basins are supposed to be tied to, you have turning points out to sea, you have straight lines going through land territory, through the middle of islands, and this is not isolated to Vietnam. I'm not picking on Vietnam. The Bahamas has a 2008 set of archipelagic baselines that completely miss a reef system that is outside the baseline system on to the northwest, facing off against the United States, where they have not yet delimited a maritime boundary. All of these straight line types of baseline, be it river closing lines, bay closing lines, archipelagic baselines, have to connect to the normal baseline. They have to be anchored to the coast. Now, the advantage of the opportunity now for coastal states is to say, right, this is our existing coast now, and we are properly defining our baselines in keeping with the Law of the Sea Convention. That's the qualification in the ILA resolutions, in the ILC's work, but also, for example, from the United States. The United States has changed its position and will not challenge, it frames it in the negative, we will not challenge the baseline claims or deposits with the UN that have been, quote unquote, properly determined in line with the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Question is, who gets to decide what's proper? But currently, we have no states saying no to this proposal. And you would define that in the Pacific Island states. Marshall Islands as an example. The legislation in 2016 is about 15 pages long. It goes through all the maritime zones. It's fairly normal. The declaration that goes with it is 451 pages long, primarily composed of coordinates. So you're defining your baselines, your 12-mile limits, your 24-mile limits, your 200 nautical mile limits through points, geographic coordinate, linked to geographic coordinate with a straight line. For the Marshall Islands, the difference, you're approximating a 200-mile arc with lots of straight lines in segments. So chords to that arc. The difference between the straight line and the true arc is always less than 1 meter in that declaration. To achieve that, you need an enormous number of points. I must admit, from a geographical point of view, this is insane. Why? Because what we're essentially doing is taking a geographical information systems, a computer designation of an arc, turning it into a text document, because that's what the UN receives through the Division of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea, because the provision was written in the 1970s. Doalos is still, I've talked to the director, or Vladimir Jarez of the Division of Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea. They've been looking at receiving electronic deposit from coastal states. But they've been looking a long time. And they probably don't have the resources to be able to do so. But it's madness to be turning a computer file into a text. And Marshall Islands is still a podium finish, but it's no longer the longest submission. The Federated States of Micronesia's submission is 903 pages long, almost entirely composed of coordinates. Extreme levels of detail for the purpose of preserving existing territory and maritime entitlement. Samoa has defined base points on its normal baseline that are 5 to 7 to 9 meters apart, all the way around the territory of the island, to almost define and hold, this is our territory, this is the definition of our land territory, so that we do not lose it in going forward, because it's legally fixed. So this is a challenge for every coastal state, including archipelagic ones, to ensure that your archipelagic baselines are up to date and you're maximizing your maritime entitlement. And then you can retain it. Of course, it doesn't solve the problem of sea level rise. You can fix your baseline and therefore where your coastline was, but bad news for the people who actually live there, suffering from inundation and erosion. So our land territory is likely to shrink. And probably this is the least exciting, in a way, area of the Law of the Sea to look at, is sea level rise. Because if you read the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's reports, and if you can't sleep, that's the way to go. The physical science basis is about 6,000 pages. This process, according to the IPCC, these changes are baked in. We are looking at an elevated sea level for centuries to millennia, quote unquote. There is nothing we can do to reverse this. What we have the power to do through reducing our emissions is to slow down the rate of acceleration of sea level rise. And that's a pretty depressing thing to be trying to teach to a younger generation. But it's still something we can do. It's not an excuse for no inaction. Any more questions, please? I realize I am standing in the way of dinner.
Sir, thank you, sir. Can you just quickly describe to us the process of us claiming the ASLs? Because we have a law now, right? I don't know, I haven't read it, but based on those two lines, for example, can states object to those before it gets accepted? And then the first question, then second question, like with the Indonesia example, if we don't set a sea lane on a certain direction, it's free for all.
Well, it's the right of the coastal state, the archipelagic state, to set and establish the ASLs. It's up to you where they go. Getting them accepted by the International Maritime Organization is a discussion in London at the IMO. And you can anticipate that other states will say, "Ooh, that's lovely. It's not enough." What about the other routes through the archipelago? Jay showed a lovely colored impression of the intensity of shipping through the Philippines archipelago. By no means do the 3 ASLs cover all of that. There are clear areas where there is an intensity of navigation now. And you can anticipate that maritime states will say, well, hang on a minute, this is great, we appreciate your ASLs, but they're only partial, because 3 is not enough. But that's a discussion at the IMO. And I think you need to prepare for that discussion to say, well, for example, you can make the argument that actually not all of the navigation that is taking place now could easily go through the ASL with very limited loss of time and therefore money for the shipping companies, and make an argument around that. But I think you'll face pushback. Fine.
I just have one question. From the geolegal viewpoint, can the Philippines legally challenge the vertical datums used by China over high tide features that China claims as having EEZ and continental shelf? If yes, how? If no, will it remain moot and academic?
Well, really, the vertical datum issue is a little bit of an illusion because we don't do so legally, generally. We leave it up to chart makers to do that job. And hydrographers naturally will choose a very low zero line for the sake of safety of navigation. So there's no way to challenge Chinese charts and chart makers. It's up to China's chart makers to do that. But what I will tell you from the experience of the South China Sea case is we created an atlas of all the high tide features, looking at the charting of the global charting authorities, the UK, the French, the Americans, the Russians, and the Japanese, although I'm not necessarily so sure I want to navigate on a Russian chart in the Southern Hemisphere anymore. They may not be quite up to date. But you also look at the national charting authorities. So you look at the Philippines charts, you look at the Vietnamese charts, you look at the Chinese charts. What you learn is that, I say this as an academic, I often stand in front of students and say, don't use AI and don't plagiarize. What I've learned about hydrographers, and I don't want to offend any hydrographers in the room, but they seem to copy each other quite a lot. There's a great degree of agreement between Chinese and British Admiralty charts, as one example, of the same features. They look really alike. It could be that that's just because that's the physical reality, and therefore repeated surveys prove that's the case, but it also looks to me very much like a lot of copying has gone on over time. And that's always a problem in map making, particularly topographic maps. There's a tendency for later cartographers to lean on the surveys that have gone before. And that's not an invalid way to proceed. But I would not think that you have a position to challenge the vertical datum of Chinese charts, but I don't think you need to very much. What you do need to challenge, and other coastal states challenge, is China seems to have an obsession with straight baselines. The enabling legislation in 1992 says we will use, essentially China will employ straight baselines along its coast. And so it's defined straight baselines along all the way from the Shandong Peninsula down to Hainan and now into the Gulf of Tonkin, and even straight baselines around Scarborough Shoal, even though that makes no sense whatsoever when you should be using under Article 6, the lowest low water line on the outer edge of the reef for an atoll or a fringing reef. Bill?
Do you think the UK and Japan have lost anything by not being archipelagic states? Would they have gained anything by declaring themselves to be one?
Well,
I know they can't.
By not being archipelagic states, they've avoided having a fight at the IMO over the ASLs they may have had to come up with, and now can not do that. But where states are not archipelagic states, they can still apply other types of baseline, including straight baselines. Where there is a debate is so-called dependent archipelagos. That is, if you are, archipelagic states are states composed of islands or parts of islands. So Greece has lots of islands, but it's not an archipelagic state. And it can't define archipelagic style baselines in the Aegean, as an example. Similarly, Canada has the so-called Arctic archipelago to the north of Canada, huge number of islands enclosed by quote-unquote historic strait baselines, which the Americans object to. There were states in the drafting of the convention, like Canada, like Greece, that were keen on the idea of using archipelagic style baselines for their dependent archipelagos. There weren't enough of those states to persuade the consensus view. So when China takes, I edited a small journal, talked to the other journal editors for the major journals for Ocean Development and International Law, International Journal of Marine and Coastal Law. They've all received lots of papers from China talking about dependent archipelagos. China is clearly a continental state. It has what look like archipelagic baselines around the Paracel Islands. They're not archipelagic baselines, not least because they would get nowhere near the land-water ratio, even if China was an archipelagic state. And there's something like 47 times as much water as there is land within the lines defined by China. So they're straight baselines. But there is a viewpoint from certain states, like China, that they should be able to define that type archipelagic style baselines around dependent archipelagos. And that causes a lot of protests from the United States. The US is the serial protester of the planet, and we need to be quite thankful for that, because those protests arguably blocked the formation of customary international law for excessive maritime claims. And of course, the US does this and analyzes everyone else's maritime practice in order to enable the US Navy to navigate as freely as possible in the broadest area as possible on the ocean. So we are beneficial bystanders to some extent to the US Freedom of Navigation program in terms of restraining excessive maritime practice, often related to baselines. Now, I'm conscious of time, and I didn't see anyone flashing a, you've got 3 minutes, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Regarding the cartoon, 2 points. First, the cartoon, the word mine, in view of what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz, it's suddenly disturbing in a different way. But in any case, sir, you mentioned, of course, the freedom of navigation of the United States and other countries. Whether or not we get the ASL lanes we want approved, what is the policy and diplomatic space for us to restrictively define normal mode under our law? I mean, is there any precedent for restricting it? For example, not allowing a combat air patrol to be included in normal mode? How can we do that?
This is the difficulty, because a carrier battle group, its normal mode is quite broad, and lots of supporting vessels and combat air patrol. That's what the US was doing in the Java Sea, and it caused huge disruption to domestic aviation in Indonesia. It was not a subtle move on the part of the US. But all you can do is protest. But it's an interpretational issue over normal mode. As an example, Australia, the Royal Australian Navy at one point was wishing to bring a vessel back from East Asia and refuel, meet a tanker and refuel. And they were initially going to do so in an ASL of Indonesia. And then they looked at it and thought, well, no, that would be stopping. It would not be expeditious passage through the ASL. We'd better not do it there. So you're relying on the good conduct of the states who are navigating through the ASLs, which of course you cannot easily guarantee. So it is a challenge that you will face. But the flip side is, currently they can navigate through anyway, applying innocent passage, and navigate anywhere throughout the Indonesian archipelagic waters. So the advantage of ASLs is at least you know where they're supposed to be. And if they don't navigate through the ASL, if it's a warship, you could protest and claim potentially damages. if there is pollution or there is some breach of your domestic regulations.
Very journalist question, but of the existential
Sorry,
salience.
a very journalist question or
Generalist.
generalist?
Yeah.
Okay.
We often talked about land features and marine or maritime baselines. We hardly talk about equitable and sustainable access to social nature goods. If the corroboratory axiology should be adequate delivery for fundamental sufficiency and well-being, we find it hard to insist on territorial sovereignty. And hence, we suggest jurisdictional stewardship. Any thoughts?
Well, my initial thought is facetious. It is my version of equitable isn't yours. And that tends to be I know about equitable result mostly through looking at maritime boundary delimitation cases between states. And as a geographer, I'm here to tell you geography isn't fair. You have to deal with the geographical reality of your coastal front and therefore the entitlement associated with it. And it's the coastal front that matters. It's the dominant relevant circumstances in maritime delimitation. The relevant coastal front, the geography in terms of opposite versus adjacent, in terms of whether there's a concavity or convexity, the relevant length of coastal front versus the opposing state, projection of your coastal front. All of those details are coming into trying to establish an equitable result for EEZ and continental shelf delimitation. And that at base, each state has a different perspective on what is an equitable or fair outcome. But the geography dictates it. So Iraq has been described as a large garage with a really small door because its coastal front is so restricted at the northern end of the Gulf. So your entitlement depends on your sovereignty over coast. And that's not equitable. It's not fairly distributed between states at all. Sorry, you have a response.
Geography won't define ethics and morality. We talk about satisfactory delivery for fundamental needs. There's baseline access to world social nature goods that must be satisfied before we reward intelligence and talent. And talent must be harmless or worthwhile. Also, intelligence. How do we reconcile that? Such that wealth distribution is defensible and income redistribution is reason. That can only be given scope in a world state. It's hard to defend nation.
I think I know where I admire the drive of the question and the comment. It's a challenge to turn that into a legal decision. Where states have argued, for example, that we're a developing state, you're a developed state, therefore we deserve a greater share of the maritime space at stake between states. And again, I'm talking about delimitation because I know it best. Courts have generally ignored that type of argument because They are delimiting a maritime boundary for all time. And tomorrow you may discover diamonds and got oil. So your present economic circumstances can have no impact on delimitation when you go before an international court. But the factors that you can negotiate with in a negotiation with a neighboring state differ. And there's no limit to the factors that may be involved in a negotiation, including economic and developmental and issues of equity. But of course, every state wants to look after its own national interest. So this becomes a very hard argument to achieve success. Okay. In which case, I thank you very much indeed for your kind attention, and on to the next session.
Thank you very much, Professor Schofield. And at this point, ladies and gentlemen, let's have another break before we finally proceed to the Ballroom B for the welcoming dinner and special lecture this afternoon until this evening. The program will start at 17:30, so please be at the venue before 5:30. Thank you very much.